Welcome to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and joining me today on the show is independent Syria-based journalist Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, welcome back.
Hi, Jesse. Thanks for getting me on. There's been a few dramatic events in Syria in the last few days.
Absolutely. So that's what I've wanted to talk to you about. So it was last Thursday, I believe, that there was another US military action in Syria that happened to make international headlines.
Yeah, of course,
So
yeah.
how has that been reported in corporate media, and what have you seen and found out on the ground?
Um, well, I mean, in corporate media, of course, they're bigging it up. But I think what it's really important to do is to put it into context, because if you go back to October 2019, when Trump carried out the strike on Baghdadi, who was the former leader of ISIS. Although, if you read through various research articles and so on, like New Lines, about the relationship between Baghdadi and Qureshi, which is one of the names of the leader that was allegedly killed by Biden and the American Special Forces last Thursday. The relationship between the two of them started sort of long before. I mean, Qureshi was involved in originally Al Qaeda. When Al Qaeda kind of morphed into ISIS in Iraq and Baghdadi became the leader, then Qureshi, even then, was an influential figure, considered by many to be more extremist even than Baghdadi in his views, and of course was involved in the massacre or the genocide of the Yazidis in Iraq in 2014. But as far back as I think it was 2009, Baghdadi was already nominating Qureshi as his successor. Now, interestingly, Qureshi was picked up. He was detained by the American Special Services or Intelligence in 2008 in Iraq, and he was imprisoned, detained, and tortured in Bucca camp. But they released him, and I think in the New Lines article they say rather ambiguously he was released for kind of unclear reasons. Now, put that into perspective. In 2009, of course, we know from Roland Humar, the former French foreign minister, that British officials had approached him to get his collaboration with their project to arm militants in Syria to overthrow the Bashar al-Assad government. Right, so the timing is interesting of his release, of course, bearing in mind that we know that ISIS is acting as another proxy of the US inside Syria. It was admitted by John Kerry in a closed session in the UN in September 2016. And there've been various. Tulsi Gabbard has called them out for using ISIS. Here on the ground, we are constantly being given the information that in the northeast, the US is ferrying ISIS fighters from Syria to Iraq, to various other areas inside Syria, into the desert, into the strip of desert between Homs and Deir ez-Zor, and to the east of Deir ez-Zor to the Bukamal crossing, for example. So, here we know that ISIS is simply another weapon in the hands of the US. But if we look at this so-called assassination, and if we look at the timing came basically around 10 days after the breakout of ISIS terrorist fighters from one of the biggest prisons in the northeast, close to Hasaka city. We now know from sources on the ground, and I'm working with a young Syrian researcher called Ibrahim Mohammed Wadi, who will be publishing a piece, I think tomorrow. I didn't get around to the final edit today. Time kind of ran out, but it should be published at Off Guardian tomorrow. So I recommend everybody go and check it out. But basically, he's been researching into what really happened. And of course, there was originally like a booby trap car, a suicide car, that attacked one point in the prison. But we have to bear in mind that this area is effectively under the control not only of the Kurdish separatists, the SDF as they're known, but also American, British, EU intelligence operatives. It's an entire enclave of American special forces and intelligence and US State Department officials occasionally when they come to visit and to try and ensure that the Kurdish factions stay on board with the US project. Prior to the attack, the Kurds withdrew, the Kurdish captors withdrew from 3 points at the prison, which allowed the exit of the ISIS fighters through those 3 points, right? They took control of the weapons, the weapons depot almost immediately, despite being surrounded by CIA and Kurdish separatists, etc. And we also need to be aware that there's a history of the Kurdish captors or prison guards taking very big bribes from the ISIS fighters to allow them to leave and to go to Iraq. Upwards of $8,000 were being paid to the Kurdish guards for them to allow specific fighters to leave if they had the money to leave. In this area alone, there are, as far as we know, 9 prisons in total, holding 12,000 ISIS terrorists. Other closed prisons are holding in excess of 70,000 wives and children. So, I mean, this is a massive number, right? Even just the 12,000 fighters, it's huge. And this has been building and building and building. And by the way, the UK is instrumental in the funding of these camps and the expansion of these camps to hold more ISIS fighters. We know that the fighters that were allowed to leave and were actually picked up by the US coalition from designated meeting places that we presume had been pre-decided, comprised of some of the highest of the command of ISIS. And that included Dutch, Belgian, various nationalities, very few Arabs. It's also interesting to note that when they were allowed to escape, they kidnapped a number of Arab civilians and 2 or 3 Kurdish. The Kurdish prisoners have been released as far as we know. There is video footage of one release at least. The Arabs have been kept prisoner. Now, that also is important to know because, of course, both the Kurdish separatists and ISIS have been responsible for the ethnic cleansing of the northeast of Syria. And so therefore, both of them have been very focused on driving out the Arab Syrian population, right? And basically, these ISIS terrorist fighters that were then ferried by the US coalition under the protection of Kurdish special forces to areas close to Bukamal and to the southeast of Deir ez-Zor, so quite close to the Al Tanf American military base. And this coincided with the increase in operations by Syrian and Russian special forces to sweep the desert clean of ISIS cells and ISIS mines and ISIS enclaves that had been established by the US, actually very much since Joe Biden came to power. That ISIS swarming operation, if you like, has been on the increase. So then, of course, in the knowledge that this is going to become to be exposed, the US collaboration with ISIS, and we know, of course, that prison breaks are a kind of, they're a common theme when the US wants to basically release terrorists into any particular country in 2013, 2014, in Iraq, etc., etc. So we know this has happened not only in the Middle East, in other places in the world also. And of course, in more recently in Kabul.
Mhm.
If you remember, after the American so-called departure, there was a breakout there in Kabul.
Yeah, it seems like
And
wherever the Americans are, there are lots of prison
yeah.
breaks.
Well, first of all, there's prisons containing huge numbers of terrorist fighters, right? And then, oh dear, we allowed a few thousand of them to escape. Now, Iraqi intelligence documents are also stating that more than 5,000 ISIS fighters were ferried by the US coalition into Iraq. And we know that certainly in the last year, again, since Joe Biden was inaugurated, ISIS has been carrying out increased attacks on, for example, Iraqi infrastructure, on electrical power stations, etc. Very much, of course, as they've been doing for 10 years inside Syria to reduce the capacity of the state in both countries to take care of its people and to provide its energy and sustenance needs, right? And so for me, this assassination in almost exactly the same place as Baghdadi was assassinated, so very close to the Turkish border, very close to Gaziantep, which is the center. It used to be called the Jihadi Express because it was the place where all the ISIS fighters from all over the world were coming and then passing into Syria. But it's also, of course, the British intelligence center. It's the center of the White Helmets. The British US manufactured humanitarian embed that is working exclusively with the terrorist groups dominated by Al Qaeda. It was the center of their operations, and therefore not surprising that they arrived 8 minutes after the US attack
Yep.
in the midst of a firefight with HTS, which is Nusra Front Al Qaeda. They arrive to kind of mop everything up. And of course, in my view, to ensure that the story is straight, right?
Hmm.
that nothing can be reported that isn't controlled by them, right? Basically, they
Yeah.
provided the information to all of the mainstream media. So from Reuters, AP, and so on, it then just radiates out, as it has done throughout the war in Syria. The majority of the narratives are provided by, as they're now called, the opposition Syria civil defense. So they've kind of gone down a rung. They're no longer neutral and impartial. they're the opposition Syria civil defense now. So I guess
Yeah.
that one's kind of slipped through.
Getting a little closer to the truth.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then if we look at Qureshi himself, as I said, he'd already, let's say, been in contact with US special services and US intelligence. And plus, as with Baghdadi, as with Osama bin Laden buried at sea, Baghdadi blows himself up. Qureshi allegedly blows himself up, killing civilians in the process. One of the U.S. helicopters is downed, although the photos are a little bit weird, to be honest, of a recently downed helicopter. Of course, then we can't identify the body.
Hmm.
But it bigs up Biden. It recreates this impression that the U.S. is fighting ISIS. That look, they've taken out the leader of ISIS. That is reigniting ISIS operations inside Syria and Iraq. And of course, it gives America the justification for maintaining its military footprint in Syria. Right, and that's a very important because and we also can't separate it from Ukraine, because Russia now is moving, I think, 6 of its landing ships to Tartus, the naval base off the coast of Syria, and from there, of course, it's much closer to the Black Sea. So this appears to be in response to the NATO buildup on the borders with Ukraine, and the claims that Russia, I think it was Bloomberg, said they'd already invaded last week. It's a bit like the
Yeah.
BBC and the
That
tower,
was
it's like
that headline was up for a half hour before they
yeah.
took it down and claimed it was a mistake because they prepare headlines in advance in case
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah, okay.
uh, proposition in the headline manifests into
Uh-huh.
reality. But
Yeah, okay.
who buys that?
Exactly. So, there seems to be a lot of maneuvering and counter maneuvering. Israel has targeted Syria, I think, 3 times since the beginning of 2022. Which that's inevitable wherever there's U.S. Maneuvering or operations or campaigns, you'll see Israel. And when I say U.S., I also mean Al Qaeda or ISIS or etc. Um, Now, Kivok Almasyan put out something on Facebook that I just picked up before I came in, saying that Russian, I'm guessing, foreign news picked up that American intelligence has plans to waken extremists and sleeping cells in the Damascus region, Latakia Governorate, and to take action against Syrian, Iranian, and Russian forces. Right, so that's important. Qatar, of course, was instrumental, put billions into this regime change war, funding the Muslim Brotherhood factions, but also into media. Al Jazeera was absolutely instrumental in enabling this war and then maintaining it and fomenting confusion amongst Syrian civilians leading up to 2011, even from 2009 onwards. So 2009 is actually an important point, and that's why it's important to note that that was when Qureshi was released, right? After a year of supposed torture and questioning and so on, we can say the programming, however you want to look at it. And the other thing is that Washington now is talking about a broad media campaign to including an Arab media. So that ties in with Qatar's sort of posturing right now of unifying the opposition and coming back for another go at the Syrian government. Because of course Qatar is also being squeezed out by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. It's been out in the cold for some time, and even Israel, because Israel is normalizing with the UAE in Yemen, with Saudi on various counts,
And it's
and
important
Qatar.
to note, I think, that the UAE is a major participant
Mm,
in World Economic Forum
yeah,
activities. There was the
absolutely.
great narrative event that was recently held in concert with the UAE. So it's important
Mm,
to note, I believe, that the UAE is part of that supranational agenda.
absolutely. Yeah, totally. And the UAE, it's the absolute. It's the hub of British and American intelligence services. I mean, Richard C. Clarke is based there in Dubai. ARC Group that manufactured the white helmets, the Free Syrian Police, where James LeMessurier was employed, based in Dubai. Mayday Rescue, that was the NGO that LeMessurier established to funnel EU, UK funds to the white helmets, was originally established in Dubai before it was moved. The registered office was then moved to the Netherlands. Um, the number, what used to be Blackwater then became Academy, and I think it's changed its name again. They were based there, but most of the kind of mercenary private security operations are based in the UAE. So very much so, the UAE is that's what it's about. And it's kind of interesting that now that Ansarullah, the resistance movement in Yemen, is starting to take the war to the UAE, right? I mean, this is a major game changer, because what's important for the UAE, it's a bit like Israel. What's important is its security, what it provides for foreign investors. And if those foreign investors start to feel insecure, I mean, they targeted the airport as Herzog arrived from Israel for the first visit in years, right? The Israeli president. I mean, it's just wonderful timing from Ansarullah. The UAE managed to intercept the missiles, but nevertheless, it's putting out the message, you're not safe. in the same way as Gaza gave the message to Israel, is that we can hit you. You know, we
Right.
can do damage, and civilians were leaving in their droves. So Ansarullah knows what it's doing, because if it can create a sense of insecurity in the UAE is kind of screwed because it hasn't got anything else. It doesn't produce anything, you know.
Right.
Um, so it's we're going through very interesting times at the moment. But what is interesting is that this um, sort of big drama from Biden is a lot about distraction, as it always is. I mean, Trump was the same. He was getting lambasted for talking about withdrawing Syrian troops, and then suddenly, you know, he assassinates Baghdadi, and then suddenly the US has to stay in Syria because now ISIS is going to be pissed off. You know, so it's the same old. Really, it's the textbook is getting a bit lame now,
Y-
and I mean, I think most people kind of see through it.
Yeah. Well, most
I
people
hope.
like you and I would say, but for a lot of people who rely on corporate media for their news, all of what you just described would be not just news to them, but it would be shocking, almost
Mm.
unbelievable. But from the research I've done, and I certainly know that you on the ground there have done excellent research and are very reliable in what you report. It is the reality of what's happening and has been happening for, as you say, decades now.
Mm.
And I'm wondering, beyond the posturing of the US and Israel in this, what is the trade-off for ISIS? As in, what do they get to do in this deal, if you will, between them and the West and Israel? Is it just that they can run amok, or are there promises, so to speak, that they can try to reestablish their so-called caliphate?
Mm. Well, I think, I mean, if you look at it, both the Kurdish separatists, I mean, that's what they have on offer. And I noticed, again, just before I came on, a headline, I think it was in the New York Times, possibly, talking about, you know, how the democratic, gender equal, women's rights Kurdish movement was suddenly seeing its dream of this haven of democracy being snatched away by the ISIS outbreak, etc. So it could also be that, you know, the Kurds have always flip-flopped from the US to Damascus, Damascus back to the US, depending on who's offering them the best deal, right? It could be that the US feels the Kurdish separatists are not reliable. I mean, ultimately, they want this area occupied. Israel wants this area occupied. From the Yinon plan onwards, they've talked about carving up Syria, and in particular east of the Euphrates, being basically another Israeli settlement in the end, right? They're increasing settlements in the Golan territories, which, you know, were illegally annexed in '67. So it could be that the US is feeling a little bit unsure about the Kurds. It could be that they're trying to put pressure on the Kurds. But for sure, what they might be saying to ISIS is okay, look, you know, we will turn over territory to you to establish the caliphate. How ideologically driven are ISIS? I mean, if you read Qureishi's kind of biography at the, is it the New Lines magazine, I think, they are pretty ideologically driven. I would argue more so than Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda, I see, is like very driven by money, by status, by power. I mean, look at the money that they siphoned out of Syria and into Turkey, for example. They've established hotels and industry in Turkey, etc. It's a lot to do with money. So ISIS, yeah, they will be looking for a quid pro quo if America is now saying, or America and the UK is now saying, okay, we need you to do this, X, Y, Z. They will certainly use them to carry out isolated attacks, as they have been doing. As I said, since Joe Biden came in, those isolated attacks have been more frequent. For example, the National Defense Forces from north of Hama, from the Syrian Christian towns there that defended themselves for years against the terrorists embedded in Idlib and northern Hama, are now, I think, on at least a monthly basis, going with the Russians to the desert to the east of Homs and basically sweeping their way across. As I said, there's joint air patrols now from both Syria and Russia. That's another relatively new development, because the northeast was effectively an American managed no-fly zone, which was giving the Kurds a huge amount of protection, but of course it was also allowing Turkey to target the Kurds. It's also kind of interesting that the connection has been made by the United States between ISIS and Turkey, because the two locations where Baghdadi and Qurayshi were killed were pretty much right on the Turkish border. So again, in my view, that's a little bit of kind of pressure on Turkey to come into line with the rest of the NATO member states. What do ISIS think they're going to get out of it? Could be the oil. They could get back their oil revenue, of course, because they lost it to the Kurdish separatists. Although they didn't, I don't believe they lost it entirely. I think there's still collaboration between the Kurds and ISIS. Certainly, as we discussed before, Al Qaeda have the monopoly on the processing of the oil that's coming out of the northeast. So it's a good question. I don't think I've entirely answered it, but I've probably put some ideas that have come to my mind while I'm talking to you.
Right. It's probably multifaceted,
Yeah.
probably not just one thing. So I want to take a look at this from the policy formation point of view, and that being, if we look at the chart of the global public private partnership that Ian Davis created, which you've probably seen before. If you haven't, he made this excellent chart that plots out the top down hierarchy of the global public private partnership. And at the top, of course, are the central banks, and underneath them are the policy formers, if you will. So groups like the CFR, the Club of Rome. So in particular, the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, is largely responsible for developing geopolitical policy, if you will, and then distributing that downward to nation states like the United States. And I read a recent piece that Max Boot, of all people, published with the CFR, really giving a glossed over, almost fictional account of what happened with this so-called assassination and what the US needs to do moving forward in not just Syria, but the broader Middle East. And that is maintaining a troop presence. And essentially what the CFR is doing in developing this policy and distributing it downward is telling the US government what to tell the media to tell the public is happening on the ground, leaving out, of course, all the complex details that you just outlined. So going off of that, why, well, not why, but what do you think the end game here is for the US and I suppose other Western forces in not just Syria, um, but the broader Middle East? Are they? Is it just keep dividing and conquering, or are they, in the interest of resource management and control? Um, because that can only go on so long in my mind. Or is there something beyond that, do you think, that they're seeking out?
Well, I mean, if you look at where for example, the Al Tanf base is, it's to the southeast of Deir ez-Zor on the border with Iraq and Jordan. Now, basically, that is an obstacle to any road route from Iran down to Lebanon and Palestine. So clearly, in the interest of protecting Israel's security, and protecting the resources, as you said, inside Syria. I mean, what's interesting is that Russia is encroaching on that US control. I mean, they're establishing an airbase in Kamishli in the northeast. So there's and as I said, there's a recent agreement of collaboration between Syria and Russia to carry out air patrols in the area, which is a kind of it's a new thing. And so I think this kind of flexing of muscles and releasing of ISIS and assassination of Croatia, etc. This is all a lot of gameplay that's going on right now. Ultimately, we know that the US is a sore loser. They don't leave countries once they've entered, unless they're forced to leave. And in my opinion, they also don't learn from history. So they don't learn from Vietnam. They don't learn from Nicaragua, etc. They don't learn. They're bullies and thugs, basically. So they assume that they can ride roughshod over what they consider to be, underdeveloped countries full of savages that have no idea about civilization, etc., which is kind of a joke coming from from a country like the United States and a country like Syria that's, been inhabited for 10,000 years. So I'm guessing that for a long time their role has been that of a spoiler. Okay, yeah, we can't overthrow the government, but what we can do now is double down on the pressure on the Syrian people. And according to this Russian intelligence information now, they're going to try and push again for anti-government protests. And of course, right now, it's probably going to be a lot easier than it was in 2011, because pre-2011, Syria was flourishing. It was a progressive reformist country. Everybody, yeah, there was corruption, but everybody had what they needed. So nobody really paid much attention, right? Now people are struggling with the basic, the absolute basic necessities of life: having a shower, having water, having clean water, having electricity, having fuel, having bread, having food that isn't extortionate prices, being able to leave, even to neighboring countries. So now I'm guessing that the US sees an opportunity to start it all over again. Literally, that's what I think is going through their minds right now. And combine that, because as I said, I don't think you can see anything in isolation. Combine that with what's happening in Ukraine, and and even in Yemen. Things are escalating in Yemen. Israel is more overtly involved now. But they're pushing harder against Yemen now, because Yemen's still fighting back, Where is it going to end up? Honestly, it's a difficult one to call. I mean, in the next month, I think I'll be heading to the north. I won't say where, and I'll probably get a better idea from a military perspective after that. if, for example, Syria and Russia are working towards really sweeping that area, then they're going to come into direct confrontation with US forces, almost without a doubt, because the US patrols the airspace there. The last thing it wants, for example, is to lose control. Not that it has control of Bukamal, but it can target Bukamal whenever it feels like it. And Bukamal is, we've talked about it before, it's the one border crossing that's still kind of under the control of Syria and Iraq resistance, the Hashd al-Shabi, that are described by the US as Iranian proxies. Yeah, it's quite difficult to call exactly what is going to happen now, but there is a sense here of a degree of escalation for
Mm-hmm.
sure.
Mm-hmm.
But my feeling is that it's not going to be like a shock and awe type thing. They're going to harry the forces. They're going to send in suicide bombers. They're going to embed mines in well-used highways, things like that. They're going to maybe attack oil depots, food depots, etc. They'll keep turning the screws on the people, basically.
Right. And I want to ask you about something we chatted about online, but
Mm.
before I ask you about that, I wanted to see if you could give me a sense of how the Syrian people are responding to all of what's happening.
They're tired. They're really tired. And I mean, we've just had a really hard 2 or 3 weeks of below zero temperatures and reduced electricity because, the electrical grid just can't cope with the electrical usage. If people are able to use their heating, we use the air conditioning units on hot when it's cold, and vice versa in the summer, and they just can't cope with it. And of course, also there was an attack on the I'm not sure what you call it, the internet cables, I guess, outside Syria, I think from the Lebanese side. And again, that plunged everyone. So not only did we not have electricity, we were also struggling, still struggling even now, for 4G and internet.
Hmm.
Very similar to Saudi's bombing, of course, the Yemeni internet. So the people they are really tired. And as I said, pre 2011, maybe the government made mistakes, but nobody really cared because they had everything they needed. Now, of course, post-war, and this is, this is typical. I mean, even after the Second World War, that's when Churchill started to lose his popularity because it's very difficult to deal with any kind of post-war depression. But then add that to US sanctions, to Trump's burning of all the food crops, Samantha Power trying to bring in modified seed that would destroy the fertility of the entire Northeast region. Luckily, it was picked up and, of course, then denied by Power and US aid. So, from Syria right now is a kind of isolated central state surrounded on all sides by occupying forces, effectively,
Right.
right? With very few of its borders secured, if you think about it, right? You have the US in the northeast, going down to the southeast on the Jordan border. Then you pick up Israel occupying the Golan territory. Then in the northwest, you have Turkey and Al Qaeda and all manner of kind of Afghani, Chechen, Uyghur, hundreds of factions, right? But supported on the whole by Turkey, dominated by Al Qaeda or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, however they want to rebrand themselves. If the threat ceases to be, let's say, existential, which it kind of is at the moment, people are floundering because they're just unhappy. They just want a normal life. They want dignity. And of course, they kind of lash out at the closest thing to them, which is the government.
Hmm.
And they don't really want to hear that, yeah, but this is all what the US is doing and so on and so forth. They're human. And the US knows this, and that's why it's now doubling down the pressure. It knows what it's doing.
Right.
And to a degree, it's having some success. If that ceases to be a kind of low intensity pressure, let's say, and then becomes another kind of military type escalation, then I think you will still see the people rally and because then in a sense it's easier for them to rally against incoming mortars than it is to rally against this kind of fog of post-war depression and economic downturn.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely more murky when you're in the territory of
Mm,
um, hybrid warfare and
mm,
lawfare, if you will.
yeah.
But it's unbelievable that after over 10 years, the US and Israel and other Western powers and other Arab states are still tormenting Syria in this
It's
way.
heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking. I mean, every day, 3, 4 times a day, we have big metal wheelie bins in most of the streets, and 4 or 5 times a day, you see kids on motorcycles come with big kind of like food sacks, and they'll pick through the rubbish and take out what they can eat and take
Hmm.
out what they can recycle and what they can sell and so on. Even in snow, rain, whatever, they're here. And really, you never saw this before. I never saw it before 2020. I don't remember seeing it as much in 2020, but now you see it all the time.
Yeah, it, that's that's terrible and absolutely the product of crimes against humanity
Mm.
and war crimes of the highest order.
Yeah, and the removal of the dignity of any citizenry as a war crime.
Hmm.
I can't say that enough. I mean, America or the US coalition has systematically destroyed civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, electrical power grids, gas lines, water supplies. Turkey has cut off water supply to the northeast whenever it feels like it, basically, when it wants to put pressure on, etc. But even in the northwest, when ISIS was in control, when Aleppo was occupied, and under siege, ISIS was cutting off the water. So this has been for 10 years. This has been systemic. This has been. I mean, the U.S. I think in 2016 bombed the thermal power station in Aleppo, and that I can't remember how many billions that's going to take to rebuild. And of course, now there's sanctions, so the restoration and rebuilding of all of these destroyed infrastructure is almost impossible, even with the input from Russia and now China's getting involved and so on. But it takes time.
Yeah, absolutely. And has the COVID-19 so-called pandemic compounded this situation?
Has it compounded it? Yeah, yes, it has. Um, then we get into the whole COVID-19 question. But what I would say unequivocally is whatever COVID-19 is, um, this is a very immune suppressed society now. As I
Hmm.
said, it's living in freezing temperatures with no heating, right? No hot water, very poor food, very low availability of food, good food. All right. So right now, yeah, the hospitals are full, and of course, it's being identified as COVID. But in my opinion, it's simply down to living conditions, stress, worry, anxiety, psychological breakdown, trauma. It's a myriad of things. But of course, yes, in a sense, they've created COVID-19 as another terror brand, right?
Right. Yeah,
That's
and
very much how I see it.
yeah, and it seems as though the utter immiseration on the ground in Syria almost renders COVID-19, whatever it actually is, irrelevant because, as you
Mm.
said, the society is, by all they've had to endure, immunosuppressed, severely
Mm.
immunosuppressed anyway. So they're going to be prone to illness and
Yeah, and we can't
health
forget that,
problems.
that America used depleted uranium here.
Mm,
So, for sure, we're going to start to see an increase, for example, in cancers. I know a number of very young people under the age of 25 who have really serious heart conditions.
mm,
Now, whether that's down to the trauma, to the stress, I don't know. But, we're barely scratching the surface on the medical fallout from this war in both senses of the word, both psychologically and from literally the chemical weapons that the United States has used here. And again, we only know of a very small percentage of the weapons they've used. But we know they use dirty weapons. We know that they don't care. We know that they were using DU tipped bullets, for example, or they were supplied to the armed groups, particularly in and around Aleppo and the countryside. I
mm,
mean, I had a friend who was in a unit of about 500 people, and a huge number of his friends died through those bullets.
mm.
So, yeah, what can I say? I mean, it still astounds me that these people can still be cheerful, can still be somehow optimistic, still be hospitable, still be generous, still be kind, because I'm not sure people in the West would be able to.
No, I don't think so at all. I think that the West, in particular the United States, really hasn't the faintest clue of what life is like for the average Syrian citizen.
Mm,
And um, I count myself among one of those people. As much research as I do, and as much as I pay attention to what's happening in Syria, I can only imagine how
mm.
horrible it is. Um,
And that's another, I mean, sorry, I slightly interrupted you, but it's
that's okay.
important. That for me is another, it's another effect of COVID, right? And I think it's a deliberate one. How many on the ground journalists are there now amongst independents, right? Because it's now so difficult to move around. And effectively, if you're an independent journalist that understands what's going on, you're against all of these measures anyway. So, like myself, I would refuse to go to a country that is going to demand a vaccine from me before I can
Mhm.
enter, right? Even the PCR tests for me are kind of an instrument of torture to some degree, having
Yeah.
done them once to leave here. Um, and so this is for me. I mean, I was saying this years ago that they want to stop us being able to go to these countries and actually report what we're seeing, actually empathize with the people that are under attack. They don't want this anymore, right? They want people reporting from isolated positions, from remote positions. They don't want them empathizing with these people. They want them to be dehumanized, right? And that for me is a very important element of this entire COVID project.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And something I've definitely thought about, but I'm glad you just put it into words there, especially you being an independent journalist based in Syria. Um, and it also, that being able to, through COVID-19, prevent independent journalism, it helps shore up the narrative that the West wants
Mm,
to put out there, like the one that recently came out of the CFR, for example, that
yeah.
it's still this binary um, sort of situation. It's the West fighting ISIS,
Mm,
and that's really all there is to it. When, as you outlined earlier, there's so much more to it than that. I mean, that's not even close to the truth of the matter. So
mm.
um yeah, I think that there is a lot to be said about COVID-19 having been manufactured for that purpose as well,
Mm,
to clamp down on independent journalism and therefore getting the truth out about what's actually happening in countries that are under siege.
mm,
Um, but what I referenced earlier, what I wanted to ask you about, is something that we don't often hear about, um, with regard to Syria, and I suppose a lot of other targeted countries in the Middle East and uh, Asia, I suppose you could say. Uh, and that's human trafficking and
mm, mm.
organ theft, if you will. This is something you mentioned that is sort of the a dirty underbelly that doesn't get, um, in my opinion, as much attention as it should. So I'm just wondering if you can go into that a little bit and
Yeah,
explain what that's all about.
yeah, I mean, I think it has that kind of reputation not only of being the ultimate conspiracy theory. I mean, honestly, when I first started to look into it here in Syria in relation to the white helmets, because I was being told by civilians, particularly in Aleppo, that it was going on and that the white helmets were involved. When I started to kind of broach the subject, even with independent media, they were like, you know, not sure we can go there. And part of it is, of course, those that are involved in child trafficking, sex trafficking, organ trafficking, they are the most evil of the evil, you know. And you have no protection if you go too far down this rabbit hole, basically, because every single institution, every single element of that institution is involved,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's the UN agencies. And this was proven by the amazing Roly Post. If you haven't read her book about the Romanian adoption was being maintained by UN agencies for profit, basically. Right? I don't know
What's
if you
what's the name of that book?
I'll look it up and tell you. I've just gone blank on it. It's Roly Post, Roelie, and she's been completely. I mean, she's gone through some of the most incredible psychological torture because of what she's exposed, you know, by the UN itself. So, you know, she gave me, if you like a massive insight into how you are treated if you tread on this kind of ground, right? And certainly, you know, from even from my perspective, the reaction from the BBC or Bellingcat, from all of these kind of governmental agencies when I started to bring up the subject was pretty vicious,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and it was pretty instant. Like, no, we don't want to go into this. So immediately you tend to think, well, okay, then there's something here, right?
Right.
Um, and so I started to kind of look into it, and then an independent NGO, the Study for Democracy, I can't remember, yeah, the Study for Democracy in Russia, Maxim Grigoriev, he picked up the investigation, and he presented the the information that he gathered inside Syria at a UN panel in December 2018, which I participated in. And he also has put all of his findings into a kind of PDF book. I'll send you the link. Um, and That's another reason that I think you know, Idlib is going to be, if at any point Idlib is liberated, then a huge amount of information is going to come to light.
Mm-hmm.
Because particularly where the assassination attempt was carried out on the border with Turkey, these are the areas where we know the bodies either alive or dead, freshly dead, of course. They have to be, I think it's within 72 hours, the organs are still functioning and are still possible to be used for transplant. Um, this area is rife with these kind of operations. And we know from testimony of former white helmets, of civilians that were living under the occupation of white helmets and the terrorist groups, they were running the bodies or the lightly injured children and young teenagers to the borders. And then we know they were being taken to the hospitals inside Turkey. We have reports from northern Idlib that there are Israeli cars or Israeli number plates in the region also. Now, that's not confirmed, but those are coming in from sources that are right on the border, right at the areas where we know the bodies are being triaged, basically.
Hmm.
You know, are they good enough? Are they not? If they're not, then they'll just get dumped if they're dead, and if they're fighters, they'll get treated and sent back. But if the bodies and the organs are considered optimum, then they'll be taken and the bodies will be sent back. The extraordinary thing in the Mayday series, the Chloe Hadjimathieu hatchet job, which was an abject failure as far as I'm concerned, she made and in a sense, she did me a favor because she actually swung a lot of academics towards my theory, because her cover up was so shoddy. I mean, she basically brought in Abd al-Kader Habak, who had been filmed working with Noor al-Zinki, a formerly US funded group that had beheaded the 13-year-old Palestinian child Abdullah Acer in August 2016, etc. And she brought him in to explain what was going on. And he basically told her, yeah, well, no, we were just taking the bodies across the border for autopsy. I'm like, seriously? You know, and I remember writing to her and saying, did you get any kind of medical feedback on this claim?
Hmm.
I mean, because, you know, in the academic group that where we all work together, the working group on Syria and propaganda, one of he's a medical doctor, and he basically said, this is ridiculous, you know, and he's the one that actually said, actually, I'm now thinking you're right, because why on earth have they done really such a bad cover up of this, right?
Yeah.
And you know, not forgetting that James Lemessurier was involved in the transformation of the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was Al Qaeda and Albanian warlords, in 1999, when they were in the midst of organ trafficking,
Hmm.
right, of Serbian, particularly Serbian children cross border. So he was working with them at the time that they were running these operations. And here he is again, running an organization, the White Helmets, that are accused of running organ trafficking operations and child abduction, child trafficking, etc. And you know, my point has always been, why isn't there an independent inquiry? I mean, you have the inquiries into Oxfam, into Red Cross, you know, the food for sex scandal, etc. But nobody's touching the White Helmets, right?
Right. Well, perhaps it's because they're still useful in a lot
Mm.
of ways, but um,
Sorry, the book is Romania, The Untold Story of Romanian Orphans.
okay,
Okay, by
I will
Rodi Post.
definitely check that out. But this, especially child trafficking, is something that's decades old, if not
Mm.
older, with regard to these uh, institutions, the NGO institutions, and other entities as well, military and otherwise. And it's something that was never really on my radar until this so-called pandemic came down upon us, and um, I started to see how children in the West were being tortured by masks, and now they're going to be subjected to toxic injections. And as I looked at that, I started coming upon interviews that Whitney Webb had done about the Finders cult, for example, or the
Mm,
Franklin scandal. Um, and at the same time, recently a story came to light, which I doubt even broached what, really went on, but the CIA being involved in child pornography, even having parents of the children involved. Um, and then just hearing from other independent reporters about the UN's long uh, involvement in this kind of activity.
mm,
And, it's horrifying. I live with my partner and she has a 6-year-old daughter. Um, and just, it breaks my heart every time I
mm.
hear about this, and that it's essentially been institutionalized for uh, for profit. It's some of, if not the most disgusting um,
Mm.
activity. I don't even know what to call it that you could think of.
It's heinous. I mean, in many cases, it's satanic.
Yeah.
It's pure evil, you know. And I'm quite sure if you start to dig into it, you'll find a connection between Epstein and the trafficking of kids from these war zones, etc. You know, it's particularly in the Balkans, for example.
Hmm.
Um, But I mean, for example, you talked about the NGOs. If you go to Bernard Kouchner, and Bernard Kouchner, of course, was the UN representative in Pristina when Lemessurier was there working with the KLA. And there's that famous video of Kouchner being asked about the yellow houses, which were the houses where they would take the still alive kids and adults to basically remove their organs. And he just gives this demonic laugh
Mm.
when he's questioned, I think, by a Serbian journalist. And Carla Del Ponte, who of course was also an advocate for the fact that in the Eastern Ghouta alleged chemical attack, it was the armed groups that had carried out the attack, not the Syrian Arab Army. But she investigated the organ trade by the KLA, and she had a huge number of obstacles put in her way. And it's actually now very difficult to get hold of a copy of her book because I tried. I could get it in French, but not in English.
Hmm.
Um, but if you go back to Bernard Kouchner, just to give an example of how these organizations are infiltrated by these, uh, I struggle to find, like you, the words, you know, pedophiles, whatever you. But back in the 60s, he was arguing for the lowering. He signed a petition for the lowering of the age of consent, and in support of, and I can't remember the name of the pedophile right now, but that same petition was signed by people like Simone de Beauvoir, etc., like by huge numbers of, and of course he's in with the Bilderbergs and etc., etc. You know, yeah, I know I'm going into conspiracy theory territory, but these these institutions exist, and the
Right.
people within them are not good people. You know,
Right.
really, they're demonic. They what they do, and then of course he had the, I think it was in Romania. Again, I'm hazy now on the names and the details, but he deliberately released a known pedophile from prison and sent him to work with orphanages in Romania. And lo and behold, he was accused of pedophilia and abuse and so on and so forth. And then basically Kushner had him flown out safely before he could be prosecuted in Romania. From Chad, he was famous for illegally bringing children to Paris for adoption.
Hmm.
When he set up Médecins Sans Frontières, Rolly Post will tell you, I don't know whether she mentions it in the book, but I think she has mentioned it publicly, that MSF was effectively, a cross-border adoption unit.
Hmm.
And I think it was in '89, he left under a sort of a cloud, and then I think it was '89, and then he set up Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders,
Right.
right? So he's kept going. You know, this is a guy who should have, in my view, be. I mean, his history is nothing but really shady,
Yeah.
but he's powerful. He's powerful, and of course, you know, he's connected to Israel. He's connected to the Zionists. He's very well connected. And this
Yeah.
is the thing, you know, if you delve into this too far and you upset too many people, eh, you have no recourse because nobody's going to protect you. That's the
Right.
thing. You
Right.
know, that's why many people kind of avoid it. But the thing is, because I came up against it because the white helmets were involved, I kind of had no choice. You know, I couldn't look the other way and sort of go, oh, yeah, it's not happening. I'll just talk about this and not about this. You know.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you because I think it's important that when we talk about Syria, when we talk about these illegal, dirty wars that the US, the West, other Arab nations, Israel are involved in, it's important to get the full picture of just how horrible they really are. And
Mm.
if that means going into these darkest of corners, I think we have to do it if we're going to be honest about assessing the situation.
It's no different with COVID. You know, people kind of recoil when you start saying to them, "This is child abuse." You know, you're torturing your own children. You know, people almost kind of, uh, but unless people face up to the depth of depravity that we're dealing with on so many different levels. You know, how many children in the UK go missing every year? Tens of thousands from children's homes. I mean, I have dozens of stories I could tell you. I mean, UK Column, I would recommend people following them because they do pick up on these stories and
Mhm.
follow them through. But in probably in every single country. I mean, how many refugees are coming in, for example, from Syria unaccompanied? What happens to them?
Right.
You know, who's tracking them? Who's following through on the detainment centers that they end up in? Where do they go from there? And all of these organizations like Save the Children, like UNICEF, look at their intercountry adoption policy. Almost all of them will endorse it, right?
Hmm.
And as Rolly Post will say to you, intercountry adoption is just legalized trafficking.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Absolutely.
know, the priority should be to put a Romanian child with a Romanian family, not uproot it from its culture, from its. Look at Vietnam, Operation Baby Lift. I don't know if you've ever looked into that, but that was horrifying.
I haven't.
Uh, Seriously, look at the photos. I mean, when I first looked at the photos, my jaw dropped. I mean, entire Pan Am aircrafts with a baby on every seat.
Hmm.
I don't know how many thousands of Vietnamese babies were just literally ripped out of Vietnam and adopted in the US.
Wow. I
And
was
it was
unaware of
called
that.
Operation Baby Lift.
Yeah. Subtle.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
I'm not surprised because, as I mentioned earlier, this, again, I don't even know what to call it. This evil goes back decades and is involved in
Yeah.
so many different operations. But
Mm.
I will absolutely look into that. Um, but yeah, again, I wanted to at least broach the subject because I think it's a vital part of the story to tell, and
Mm.
some of the worst, if not the worst, crimes that need to be exposed and talked about. And um, in my mind, they're purposely given um, that taboo so that
Mm.
people like you and I don't go there. That
Exactly.
we're
Yeah.
afraid we're afraid to go there because we're afraid of being labeled conspiracy theorists or flat earthers or whatever.
Yeah, I know.
But
No, I mean, look, the worst offender and probably the number one in illegal organ trade is, of course, Israel.
mhm,
Although they will point the finger at China. I mean, this was interesting when I looked into Owen Kotler and his involvement in Canada and the best friend of Alan Dershowitz, which
mm,
again, it leads me to think there's got to be a connection somehow. Some of these kids have got to be ending up in that stream, because I tend to see it as in a way of streams. Like you have the organ trafficking stream, sorry, you have the child trafficking stream, you have the sex trade trafficking stream, right? And then you probably have the kind of the specialist sex trade, which will include underage, right, pedophilia, all the rest of it, the Epstein type operations. Because look at the size of the Epstein operation.
right.
It's not about one guy. It's as Whitney Webb, I mean, totally blew that open. So when
Mhm,
you consider the institutions, the oligarchs, the billionaires, the royalty, the politicians, and so on that are involved in this, for sure, if they can facilitate Syrian uh, youngsters being brought from Syria to wherever they want them, right? They will do it.
yeah.
And I mean, Israel is famous for abusing female prisoners.
Mhm,
So it's not something new. Saudi Arabia traffics from Yemen. It's not something that is. It's not some kind of fantasy. It's not some kind of conspiracy theory. It happens. There are bad people in this world. There are really evil people in this world, and we can't keep pretending that they're not there, or that they're not participating, or they're not exploiting these wars for their own depraved and perverted ends.
right. I absolutely agree, and I think a lot of people's inability to even consider that that darkness is out there has really been exposed in the past 2 years, and it's been shocking to see some of the people who will just outright dismiss what we're talking about
Mm,
as conspiracy theory or
mm,
um, you know unproven, or there's no evidence of that, or however they want to spin it. But
mm.
it is happening, and it's been happening on a large scale for a long time, and we have to talk about it.
Look, we've pointed out that the U.S. is uh, is behind ISIS. ISIS is a proxy of the US. So are the majority of the armed groups. When you look at, just take one small element of the war in Syria, when they invaded eastern Aleppo, they took over a psychiatric hospital close to the airport. I visited it quite a few times. They executed a number of the psychiatric patients because they were cursing God, because some were schizophrenic, some were had various other um, ailments, whatever you want to call them, right? Um, they executed them on the spot for
Mm,
blasphemy. They kidnapped and raped a number of the raped on a multiple basis some of the female patients. The others, because they were not mentally all there, they used them as suicide bombers because they were easy to persuade. So look, if the US can turn a blind eye to this kind of atrocity, not to mention the atrocities committed in the Alawite towns and villages in Latakia, in Bruta, and so on and so forth, in Adra to the north of Damascus, you can't even imagine the siege of Kafraya and Fua, two Shia villages in Idlib, by Ara Sham and Nusra Front. If one of their own soldiers died, they would take the head off and put it on a stake and like parade it in front of the besieged villages,
mm,
right? This is not warfare. This is not even extremist Islam. This is Satanism, the dismembering of bodies of prisoners of war. You know, if you speak to any Syrian army soldier, even any Russian soldier, the last thing what they will kill themselves to do is to go and recover the bodies of their fallen comrades.
Mm.
Why? Because if they leave them, the body will be taken and dismembered and the
Hmm.
head impaled somewhere else, right? As I said, this isn't warfare. This isn't this isn't a war. This is just it's the injection of absolute perversion and depravity and extreme violence. um, Terrorism isn't a strong enough word for what has gone on here, really.
Yeah, I agree. And again, as hard as it is to talk about these things, if we're going to have honest discussions, we have to hit on these brutal truths. And
Mm.
I thank you for being willing to go there, being one of the few journalists who's willing to go there. And I think that's why your work is so valuable, so important, not just to me, but to so many people. And um, I hope that you're able to keep doing it for a lot longer, or as long as you can stand doing it. So you mentioned that you're working on a piece for Off Guardian that'll be published in the next day or so.
Yeah, it should go up tomorrow. It was actually written by a young Syrian researcher, Ibrahim Mohammed Wadi. He wrote one piece which is actually I'll send you the link because he goes into a lot of detail about the armed groups in Idlib, their affiliations, their funding, their ideology, etc., etc. And even I thought I kind of knew quite a lot of stuff, but even I was quite, wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know there were extremist Kurdish factions that actually want a caliphate there. Like,
Mm,
I didn't know all of this. So it's quite interesting. It's quite a long read, and you need to be kind of really into it and really interested. So this article, he's basically gone through the stuff that I talked about, the escape from or the breakout from the prisons in Hasakah and how the US has maneuvered them. He found various videos and documents to support his theory, and he's done a good job of kind of researching it.
excellent. Yeah, I look forward to both of those. I'll be happy to read them and share them because
Thanks.
again, more knowledge that or more facts that people need to be aware of.
Yeah,
Uh,
and facts that are not being produced by very well paid American think tanks that are there just to kind of push narratives in the direction that suits the various American regimes. It's like
yeah,
you,
yeah,
you really, nothing beats on the ground understanding of a situation. It really doesn't, and that's what I'm saying. That's what COVID is hoping to destroy.
yeah.
You
I agree. And I think the proof is right in front of us. We've seen it happen, and
Mm.
we can see it in the quality or lack thereof of the news that's being produced, that's been produced over the past 2 years, especially.
Mm.
Um, it's like reading something out of a fantasy land most of the time.
I think people are becoming a little bit more clued in. I mean, I've noticed how people are trying to kind of attack the Ottawa convoy, the trucker
Mm,
convoy. And it's not really working, except with the very kind of brainwash that just basically get all their news from CBC and that's it.
yeah,
But on Twitter, for example, it's not really going down very well.
no,
You know,
no, and the people who are attacking it just sound like
yeah,
actual fringe lunatics, like the
yeah,
like
exactly.
the people Trudeau is trying to paint the truckers as.
Exactly. I mean, I experienced this with the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France. I went
Mhm,
to a number of demonstrations and I wrote about it. And of course, they tried to infiltrate them. Of course, they had the agent provocateur breaking windows and smashing up cafes and blaming it on the Gilets jaunes. But
mhm,
you know, this is inevitable. They're afraid. I mean, and the trucker convoy is probably the you know the biggest mobilization of working class factions from all denominations, certainly in my lifetime that I can remember.
Right.
I mean, I'm kind of scratching back, but I think so. You know, maybe the miners' strike in the UK, but I'm really going back there. But in recent times,
Yeah.
it's kind of extraordinary.
And I think that's why the elites, the oligarchs,
Yeah.
they're so terrified of it, and they're just working overtime to smear it in any way they can, because
Mm,
they know that that type of working class solidarity, especially um, in the numbers we're seeing with the trucker convoys, not just in Canada, but a lot of other countries as well, that it's, once it really coheres or coalesces, it almost takes on a force of its own that,
mm,
you know, these oligarchs don't really stand a chance against, unless they're willing to bring out ultra violent force against it, which is also something to be afraid of and concerned about. But
mm,
I don't know that they'd be willing to go that far, because I think they realize that a lot of people around the world are sick and tired of what's been going on for the past 2 years, and are
mm.
just not going to take it.
Yeah.
So we'll
Yeah.
see. But um, it's good that there is a huge contingent, or huge contingents of people coming together and fighting back. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't want to take up any more of your time. I really appreciate you having
I
this.
might lose internet. It's kind of going down, and I'm watching it, but it's kind of it's
Okay.
fluctuating a bit, so I might suddenly disappear anyway.
Okay.
But
Well,
no, thanks for
uh,
having me on.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you again. And thank you for your excellent work. And I look forward to another conversation soon.
Okay, take care, Jesse.
You too.
Bye bye.